And what a privilege is ours to know where we stand in the book of Revelation. And we stand in this particular section of Scripture that we've just read. So will you open your Bibles, if you haven't already done so, to Revelation chapter 16, where we start with the sixth angel pouring out his vial on the great river Euphrates. And we understand that what happens following this vial being poured out is that the Euphrates is dried up. And Christadelphians and many Bible students for centuries have known what this vial means. Because the great river Euphrates was a symbol for the Ottoman Empire. Why is it a symbol for the Ottoman Empire? Well, simply because the Euphrates, when you track back, when it's drying up as the river goes back, begins in Turkey. So we need to be very clear, this is not a Christadelphian idea. This has been around since, well, at least the 1600s, where Bible students have understood that the great river Euphrates has meant the Turkish Empire. And in the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire dried up. You could argue it's still drying up, but it's dried right up. And so, brothers and sisters, young people, we know this. Chapter 16 and verse 12 has happened. Chapter 16 and verse 16 hasn't happened. Armageddon has not yet taken place, which places you and I in history in three verses. Revelation 16 verses 13 and 14, and actually verse 15 is a support tip for us living in those days. So the history is in chapter 16 verses 13 and 14, where we read, I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They're the spirits of devils, and they've got a job to do. And their job is to gather together the nations of the world, the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to the great day of God Almighty, the battle of Armageddon. So the frog-like spirits have a very specific role to do. Now, has anyone ever been here? I'd be impressed if you had. This brother has. Where is it? It is in France. It's not quite Paris, right? But it's not a million miles away from Paris. As far as we're concerned, probably in Canadian terms, you would simply say Paris, right? Because it's 3 hours away, right? It's in Reims, right? It's in Reims, which is in northern France. And there's a cathedral there in Reims that we visited this last summer. And next to this cathedral is this palace. It's called the Palais de Taux. Now, my French is appalling, and I suspect I've said that wrong, and some of you are thinking, Pete, that is not how you say it. But it's something like that. And in this palace, next to this very famous old French cathedral, is a tapestry. And on that tapestry are is depicted an ancient French battle. And on their banners, you can just about, I hope, make out 3 frogs. And I'm seeing some faces like this, right? And so I can promise you can have the slides afterwards, right? But on those banners are 3 frogs. Now, I want you to just park that thought. We shall come back to it shortly. Boys and girls, where do you come across frogs in the Bible? Where do we come across frogs? Were you going to say, did you say Egypt? You're so clever. Come on then, let's go to Exodus. Come on. Exodus chapter 8. Good boy. Exodus chapter 8. where we know, don't we, the story, and you just told us, good boy, the story of the 10 plagues. And one of those plagues was the plague of the frogs. And where did the frogs go? They went everywhere, right? Exodus 8, verse 3. The river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, into your bedchamber, on your bed, in the house of your servants, upon your people, in your ovens, in your kneading troughs. The frogs shall come up both on you and on your people, upon all your... They're going everywhere. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. The frogs are going to infiltrate your life. And of course, in the end, the frogs are dealt with. Because Pharaoh says he will let the people go, the frogs are dealt with. And so we read, verse 11, that Moses says, the frogs shall depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, from your people. They shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh. And Moses cried to the Lord because of the frogs which he brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the houses, and out of the villages, and out of the fields. And note this phrase. They gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. Now we'll come back to it. They gathered them together. That should remind you of a verse that we've just read in Revelation 16. They gathered them together. And when they're gathered together upon heaps. And the land stank. We'll come back to it. Now, Brother Thomas rightly said, writing in Elpis Israel 170 years ago, from this evidence that I'm about to adduce, I think I'll be able to convince the reader that the frogs are the symbol of the French democracy. And why did he think it? Well, he looked carefully at what other Bible students also thought and looked at the history of the French, starting with the Merovingian kings, Clovis I, and the banners that they had back in the 400s, in the years of Clovis, who is known historically to be the first king of France. The heraldic symbol of the Frankish Merovingian dynasty of kings was 3 frogs. Clovis united the Frankish tribes under one ruler. His was the first royal house to rule the whole of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Charles de Gaulle said, the history of France starts with Clovis. What was his banner? 3 frogs. Clovis was the first king of the Franks to unite all of the Frankish tribes under one ruler. He became known as the first king of France. Now, he's also significant for one other major fact, because in that cathedral in Rheims, he was baptized. Not into the faith that we would consider baptism, rather, he was converted to Catholicism. He's significant due to his conversion to Catholicism in 496. So he was just a member of a Germanic tribe. But this man who became the leader and became the king became converted to Catholicism, as opposed to the Arianism of most other Germanic tribes. Now that's of interest to us, because what then happened is that following Clovis, centuries later came Charlemagne and the birth of the early Holy Roman Empire. So we see the Roman Empire still very much a part of what France is about. We just note that he's converted from Arianism. Do we know what Arianism is? Okay, I can hear people muttering, and they're muttering on the right lines. Arianism is often considered to be a form of Unitarian theology, in that it stresses God's unity at the expense of the notion of the Trinity. So this man, Clovis, who uses the frog-like spirits as his banner, is converted to Catholicism and the Trinity. So you can see in this particular place in Rheims, banners advertising the commemoration of his baptism. And on the armour here, we see clearly 3 frog-like spirits. Now, many years later, we understand that one of the earthquakes in Revelation is the earthquake of the French Revolution. And from that came this great change. Brother Thomas said, didn't he, I can convince you that the 3 frog-like spirits are the symbol of the French democracy. Well, there was no democracy before the French Revolution. And the French Revolution changed everything, didn't it? It changed the course of world events, which is why it's an earthquake in Revelation. Because no longer did you have the aristocratic fat cats in France and the peasants, the poor. Rather, common man could be the ruler. We see it epitomized, don't we, just south of this border. Right? Right? That is the epitome of the feet of clay. Because clay is about common men. And common man can be voted into office. That's the result of the French Revolution. Now, this year's been a major anniversary. Why? What have we been doing lectures about in our halls across the world? 70th anniversary, the State of Israel, right? Well, it's also another one. And it's the 70th anniversary of a document that this man wrote. Does anyone recognize it? He looks rather like me in about 20 years' time, doesn't he? Right? Alas, this chap is a man called René Cassin. And we've not heard of him, have we? So René Cassin was a Jew, a French Jew, living in France. He fought in the First World War. Unsurprisingly, he was an extremely bright man. And following the Second World War, he was working as a lawyer, and he was tasked with writing a major document. He was tasked with writing the UDHR. Now, what's the UDHR? Human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, countries across the world, from December 2017 to December 2018, are entering into all sorts of commemorative acts, nothing to do with the State of Israel being declared, but with this document being created, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at 70, a cause for celebration, they say, a time to remember. René Cassin is known as the father of the Declaration of Human Rights. How did he go about writing this document? How did he do it? I'll tell you what he did. René Cassin played a decisive role in drawing up the 1948 Declaration. René Cassin presented a preliminary draft on the 16th of June 1946, which was adopted as a working basis. Now, here's the dynamite. It can be seen that his preliminary draft included the entire contents of the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. His document, the UDHR, took the whole of the 1789 document, which is the frog-like spirits. Do you see? Do you see the connection? That's what this man did. And so we have this document today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which underpins everything that the United Nations does. The UDHR came out of the conflict of the Second World War. René Cassin was a Jew living in France that was raised up for a purpose, to put this document together, which would one day support the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And he, like many others, thought they were doing such a good deed, as many across the world see it today. If you go on the United Nations website, they'll give you a history of human rights law. And they'll tell you, so this document that's on the UN website, if you kept reading, it says this: the traditional categorization of 3 generations of human rights used in both national and international human rights discourse traces the chronological evolution of human rights as an echo to the cry of the frog-like spirits. Well, it didn't quite say that. To the cry of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. So what does the world say, and why does this matter to us? Because the world says this. The UN Human Rights Council declares Israel as the world's #1 human rights violator. Now, when you think of the despotic regimes across the world, when you think of the nightmare countries and political parties ruling in some countries, it is farcical that this nation, no bigger than Wales, which doesn't help you, but it does help me, is the world's biggest human rights violator. And what's the key issue? Because they gave them, the UN gave Israel the land, didn't they? So in 1947, they split the land up. And because of the events of the Second World War, for all of the horrific acts that took place, it took 6 million Jewish people being exterminated for prophecy to be fulfilled, and for the world to give Israel that homeland and to bring them back there. The United Nations put together the map. And it lasted for approximately 19 years, from 48 to 67. And in 67, following the events of the Six-Day War, Israel took huge amounts of the land and said it was theirs. Bible prophecy says it is theirs. The world says it is not theirs. And so the human rights violations that the world is so furious with Israel for is because of their occupation, as the world would say, of the land. For half a century, Amnesty International says, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, has resulted in systematic human rights violations against Palestinians living there. So there's the territory that they say that they've lost. We need to understand what we're talking about when we read the West Bank. I'd like you to turn to Ezekiel. Come to Ezekiel chapter 36. You see, the West Bank is the mountains of Israel. So this territory here on the map, many of you who will have been to Israel will have seen the topography of the land, and you can't help but notice, as you leave Jerusalem and you head east, so there's this plateau of land going down to the south, going up to the north. As you come in from the Dead Sea, you look from Jericho, there's this plateau of land, these mountains going north to south, the West Bank, the mountains of Israel. And so when we read Ezekiel 36, which is a prophecy Ezekiel gives against, have a look carefully, the mountains of Israel, we note in our margin the West Bank. And what does God say he's going to do at the time of the end? Verse 8. But ye, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. Well, they've come. They're in the land. Behold, I'm for you, and I will turn unto you, and ye shall be tilled and sown. What will we do with the West Bank? I will multiply men on you. All the house of Israel, even all of it, the cities shall be inhabited, and the wastes shall be builded. I will multiply on you man and beast. They will increase and bring fruit, and I will settle you after your old estates. And so, sure enough, that is what's happened. Following 1967, that prophecy has been fulfilled. Because Jewish people have multiplied on the mountains of Israel, on the West Bank. This prophecy has been fulfilled in most of our lifetime. That's incredible, isn't it? And they keep settling. Here's West Bank settlements. I just want you to note what Brother Thomas said. It may be remarked here, he writes in Eureka in the 1870s, that there will have been a considerable gathering of Israelites upon the West Bank before the invasion of the country by Gog. Well, he was right, because he read Ezekiel 36. It's happening, it's on. Look at this. From 1980, look at the population rise in the West Bank. I will multiply men on you. Look at this. This graph shows you the total settler population. The blue line with the exponential growth is the mountains of Israel. Look at this graphic. I will multiply men on you. Men will settle on you. Brother Thomas says there will be a considerable gathering on the mountains of Israel before the invasion of Gog. And the UN are furious. And many of you will have seen 18 months ago, they voted on ending the Israeli settlements. And a UN resolution was passed, UN Resolution 2334. And that resolution was historic, because to pass a resolution, it has to go through the Security Council, the permanent members of the UN, and every single one of them has to either agree it or abstain from the vote. And if they vote against it, it can't pass. And for decades, America always stood with Israel. One of the last things that Obama did in office was allow this resolution to go through. He abstained. And so Resolution 2334 was passed. You can find this on the internet. The United Nations Security Council, just type in Resolution 2334, and you'll see that what it says is that it condemns all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. It reaffirms that the establishment by Israel of settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. What's international law? What's it based on? The UDHR. It reiterates its demand that Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. It calls upon all states. Well, we're expecting, aren't we, the frog-like spirits to gather the kings of the earth and of the whole world. And so the world is furious with Israel's occupation. Why? Because Human Rights Watch keeps saying, and others, they're violating international human rights law. What's it based on? Let's get it clear. The UDHR. What's it based on? 3 frog-like spirits. And so you'd think, wouldn't you, that following that resolution, when the world says you've got to stop building, that they're going to stop building. And then God, in an instant, changes the course of world events. Because Barack Obama leaves office. And Donald Trump comes into office. And we look at this man and we understand Daniel's prophecy like never before, that it is God who rules in the kingdoms of men. He gives it to whomsoever he will, even to the basest of men. We live in the days of the clay. And so, Trump comes into power. And only a character like this, right, is going to go against the whole of world opinion. And Israel says, terrific, we'll keep building. And of course they're going to keep building. Because Ezekiel chapter 36 tells us they're going to keep building. Do you see? There was no choice. The angels had to do it. Because if someone like Obama had stayed in office, they'd have had to stop building and that prophecy would have stopped. Our God's an extraordinary God. The angels are continually working with world events. And although sometimes we look and we try to understand what's happening, we know that God is in control. And so they keep building. What does the UN say? Stop building! They call for an end to Israel's occupation of Palestine. Israel accuses UN of bias as it carries out a human rights review. And then they keep being told off more and more and more as delegations go back to the UN and tell them they keep building. There's nothing they can do because it's written in Ezekiel chapter 36. Now I want us just to move left field, and I want us to focus our minds on Europe just for a few minutes. Because not only has there been a major political shift in North America that's affected the world, so has there been in Europe. Because for for decades, the engine house and ruler of Europe has been Germany. And then a fresh, handsome, young Frenchman is voted into office. Emmanuel Macron. And he comes with an agenda. What's his agenda? It's a human rights agenda. And so the world says, well, hold on. The Economist runs. The spotlight is shifting from Germany to France. Merkel should follow Macron's lead on Europe. Emmanuel Macron warns European leaders they've got 1 year to reform the bloc. Macron, not Merkel, is Europe's most powerful leader. Time magazine, the next leader of Europe. What are they saying? They're saying the new Napoleon. Because the angels want the Christadelphians to know that something's occurring to do with the French Revolution, to do with the three frog-like spirits. A Napoleon for the 21st century. How France's president made his mark on the world stage. And the BBC article says, I think Macron has a chance to appear as the leader of the free world. Why do you think they're looking for someone else? Because they can't cope with Trump, right? That's the fact of the matter. France alone cannot do everything. But if we look at his speech to the UN General Assembly, his speech was completely focused on the frog-like spirits, human rights. Emmanuel Macron says, France is back at the core of Europe. And what does he say in his speech? He wants a more sovereign, united, and democratic Europe. Well, we're not surprised. Because what do we read when we turn the page from Revelation 16 to Revelation 17? That the nations will give their power and their strength to the beast, to Europe. We will never build something sufficiently ambitious at 27. Isn't that interesting? Wonder what he's going for. He's got a 10-year strategy. Maybe he's going for 10. Maybe he's interested in 10 horns or 10 toes. We don't know. If some people are ready to be more ambitious, he says, to go further in terms of integration and ambition of what makes you sovereign as a power in this global environment, to defend your values and your interests, let's move. says Macron. And so he goes to visit the Council of Europe. And he gives a speech to the European court. And what's his speech about? It's about human rights. He says France's commitment to the principles enshrined in this convention goes back a long way. The Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen of 1789 is, of course, the main wellspring of these principles, of the principles of human rights. However, its roots lie even deeper in the ground of Renaissance humanism, in the legacy of antiquity, in the concept of the human being that France has constructed over the centuries. The human rights proclaimed during the French Revolution, then subsequently reaffirmed time and again and reinterpreted by the great minds and statesmen of our country, are an integral part of this core identity which goes back a very long way. It is not insignificant, he says, that the UDHR was adopted in Paris in 1948. Imagine the Christadelphians in 1948. They'd known this, that happening in Paris is a document pulling together the frog-like spirits. Nor is it a coincidence that a French city, Strasbourg, is today your home. Rest assured that for us, the French, this is of the utmost significance. And so this year, Emmanuel Macron was awarded an international prize. Do you know what the prize was? It's given by the people of Aachen, which is a city in northwest Germany, every year. And they've given it since the end of the Second World War, and they give it to an individual that they see has promoted European unity. It's called the Charlemagne Prize. Because Charlemagne, of course, was the emperor that united France and Germany. He's the founder of Europe, as we see it today. Emmanuel Macron awarded Charlemagne Prize for a vision of a new Europe. He's honoured for his European vision. And do you know what they say on their website? Emmanuel Macron has declared a strong belief that modern political life must rediscover a sense for symbolism. What better illustration of this than the unprecedented scene of a newly elected French president crossing the courtyard of the Louvre, not to the melody of the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, but to the music of the European anthem, to address his supporters and emphasize France's firm anchoring in the European Union. Just note this. This man spent his childhood attending a Jesuit school. He's got all the credentials in place. I just thought you'd find this BBC article from 2 weeks ago, possibly 2 weeks ago, interesting. French beating scandal reveals Macron's feet of clay. Right? Just interesting, isn't it? And so, brothers and sisters, little children, we live in the days when the frog-like spirits have gone out. And what God is going to do is gather all nations. And we're told where he's going to gather them. He's going to gather them to Armageddon. We read it from Revelation 16. We know it from Joel chapter 3. And from Zechariah chapter 12, we understand that Jerusalem's going to be at the heart of where the nations are gathered. In that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. The nations will be gathered to Jerusalem. And so the angels go to work. And Trump has whisperings in his ear. You know what you promised in your election manifesto that every American president before you has also promised, but failed to deliver on? We're going to need someone as awful as you, who is prepared to not care what the rest of the world says and move your embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I'll do it, right? And so he says, doesn't he, in just this year, well, in December actually, 2017, that the Americans were going to move their embassy to Jerusalem. Why did that need to happen? It needed to happen to bring the world's eyes on Jerusalem. They're fed up with Israel's human rights record, and now it's centered around the issues of Jerusalem. And so what do they say? Well, the UN, the European Union, and the Pope criticized Trump's Jerusalem announcement. Putin is deeply concerned by Trump's Jerusalem move. What does he say? He says that Moscow believes that the status of Jerusalem should be settled through talks between the Palestinians and Israel in line with the frog-like spirits, in line with the United Nations resolutions, as if Putin cares at all about UN resolutions, right? This guy doesn't care a jot what the world thinks about what he does. He marches into Crimea and gets guys who've walked in white uniforms to take them off with military attire underneath and say, it's ours. That doesn't quite fit with UN resolutions. Why is he saying it? He can't help it. Because he, and he represents Russia at this time, is the dragon. And the frog-like spirits, we are told, are going to come out of the mouth of the dragon. That's why he's calling on the UN resolutions. Let me just show you this too.
Rivolgere un accorato appello affinché sia impegno di tutti a rispettare lo status quo della città in conformità con le pertinenti risoluzioni delle Nazioni Unite.
And we've always regarded Jerusalem as a final status issue that must be resolved through direct negotiations between the two parties based on relevant Security Council resolution.
The European Union supports the resumption of a meaningful peace process towards a two-state solution. We believe that any action that would undermine these efforts must absolutely be avoided.
Okay, our sound isn't just quite right, for which I apologize, my fault. But I want you to notice who's speaking, right? Who did you see there on the screen? You saw Europe speaking. You saw the Pope speaking. Are we surprised? Of course we're not surprised. Because the frog-like spirits have to come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. And so, do you notice what they're saying? They're saying we think that the issue of Jerusalem must go to the UN resolutions. Macron, of course, is able to speak on behalf of all of Europe. France and Europe, he says, are attached to a two-state solution. You've got to go back under the auspices of the United Nations, the resolutions of the UN Security Council, Macron tells reporters. Pope Francis urges world leaders to respect the UN position on Jerusalem. And check this out. If that's not enough, what does he do this year? He says there's a great celebration going on because it's 70 years since, and you think he's going to say, don't you? The state of Israel, he's not interested in the Jews coming back to the land. He wants the whole world to use the frog-like spirits. Pope Francis, this is from the Catholic Church Times, urges the use of the UDHR, now in its 70th years. He hails this marvelous document. The modern understanding of human rights is perfect, he says, with the Christian view. For the Holy See to speak of human rights, above all, is to reinstate the centrality of the human person willed and centered by God in his image and likeness. And so he goes on. Let me just play this video for you.
As I said in December, our greatest hope is for peace. The United States remains fully committed to facilitating a lasting peace agreement.
While presidents before him have backed down from their pledge to move the American embassy once in office, this president delivered. Because when President Trump makes a promise, he keeps it.
The truth is that Jerusalem has been and will always be the capital of the Jewish people, the capital of the Jewish state. May the opening of this embassy in this city spread the truth far and wide, and may the truth advance a lasting peace between Israel and all our neighbors. God bless the United States of America, and God bless Jerusalem.
So do you see that because of what's happened, the world is drawn in to Jerusalem? That we're seeing coming out of the mouth of the dragon. Russia, once again, slammed US envoy's statement on Gaza at UN. Russia says that they're deeply alarmed by Gaza clashes. The EU, out of the mouth of the beast, calls for Israel, Hamas, to show restraint in Gaza. The false prophet, Pope Francis, joined by Cardinal Nicholas, in condemning Israeli killings in Gaza. And what do they say? Well, the BBC News write the articles. Did Israel use excessive force at the Gaza protests? Brothers and sisters, this is the last couple of months. And that article goes on to say, the great question is, what do human rights groups say? And what do human rights groups say? They say Israel's Gaza response was wholly disproportionate. And so there's a debate in the United Nations on May the 18th of this year. And they vote to send in a human rights probe into Gaza to the fury of Israel. UN to launch war crimes investigation into Israeli forces shooting of protesters. UN votes to send war crime investigators to Gaza. And reports keep coming back to the United Nations. And the reports say, we've got to do something, we've got to do something. And they blame Israel for what they have done. And so surely it's only a matter of time. We see that Israel blames Iran for Gaza border violence. We know that Iran are operating in the region. We're not surprised, are we? Because they're there in Ezekiel chapter 38. I'm conscious of time, brothers and sisters, so I'm going to move us through. But you know, don't you, that as a result of the UN Human Rights Council's treatment of Israel, the United States, just this last month, at the end of June, they quit the Human Rights Council. And this is what the US Secretary of State had to say on it.
A mere look around the world today demonstrates that the Council has failed in its stated objectives. Its membership includes authoritarian governments with unambiguous and abhorrent human rights records, such as China, Cuba, and Venezuela. There is no fair or competitive election process, and countries have colluded with one another to undermine the current method of selecting members. And the Council's continued and well-documented bias against Israel is unconscionable. Since its creation, the Council has adopted more resolutions condemning Israel than against the rest of the world combined.
That's an incredible statistic, isn't it? Since the creation of that Human Rights Council, there have been more resolutions adopted against Israel than the rest of the world combined. That's an extraordinary statistic. And we look at it and we say, it's not fair. And it isn't. But it doesn't matter. The angels are making it happen. Because it's the frog-like spirits that have to gather the nations to Armageddon. And so you and I look at it, and we're filled with excitement. because the nations are going to Armageddon. And what do we see? Just in the last week or so, 3 Israelis stabbed to death in the West Bank attack. Reports go back to the UN. On the 27th of July, what are we talking now? 3 or 4 days ago, something like that? Israelis stabbed to death by Palestinian in West Bank attack. So what do they say they're going to do? Israeli Defense Minister calls for West Bank settlement expansion. What are we going to do? We're going to keep building. What do we expect to see? Ezekiel 36. I will multiply men on you. And so, brothers and sisters, I want to draw our thoughts to a close. Will you come back to Exodus chapter 8? Very quickly. Exodus chapter 8. Where we saw those frogs being dealt with. And I'm sure you picked up the language in verse 14. They gathered the frogs together. They gathered them together. Now that, you should have in your margin next to that phrase, Revelation 16:16, where the nations are gathered together. It's exactly the same phrase. Obviously, one's Greek, one's Hebrew. It's the same phrase. He gathered them together to a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. Now, of course, Armageddon means a heap of sheaves in a valley of threshing. So they're gathered together, the frogs, in verse 14 or 13, in heaps. And we also understand that the land stank. Well, we're not going to turn there, but put in your margin Ezekiel 39:11. Because do you remember, following Armageddon, Ezekiel 39 says that the bodies that are heaped up are so numerous and so awful as the destruction been, that when a man walks through the land, what it says is he's got to hold his nose because of the smell. And so do you see this picture here in Exodus? I just want you to note one other thing from this. That Hebrew word heaps, in the Hebrew it's repeated. It's actually heaps, heaps. In other words, there's so many of them. But this Hebrew word is used on 31 occasions, this heaps, right? And these are the different ways it's translated. It's the Hebrew word chomer. And the first time it's used, I think, is amazing. You see, it's often translated clay, right? Well, we're interested in that. The first time it's used is in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 3. And the heaps, the clay, is the mortar that holds Babel together. Isn't that amazing? Babel stands for everything to do with the systems of this world. How is it held together? Well, it's held together with the frog-like spirits. It's held together with the heaps of the frogs, if you like. And so, brothers and sisters, we'd like to finish. And in Revelation chapter 16, you don't need to turn there. The verse is for you on the screen. After those verses that we've been looking at of the frog-like spirits, and before Armageddon is mentioned, there's a little verse, and that's actually put in brackets, but obviously there's no brackets there. Behold, the Lord Jesus says, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. Brothers and sisters, I hope that in our address tonight, you can see it is on. We don't know the day or the hour when the Lord will come. We pray not that the Lord will come soon. We pray the Lord will come tonight. Everything is in place. The nations are set around Jerusalem. They're ready to go. Are we ready? Are we watching? Are we keeping our garments? When the Lord comes, Is he going to be pleased to look at you and me and say, you watched, you gave it your very best, and because of your faith in these things, I'll make up the rest. Come into my joy. Enter into your desired haven.